Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Conversations on Race and Policing. Today we will be joined by Marisol LeBrón. Before we begin, I would like to read our land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, the Yuhaviatam. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. I'll turn it over now to Robbie Madrigal.
Thank you, Matt. We're delighted to have our special guest, Dr. Marisol LeBrón. She's an associate professor in feminist studies and critical race and ethnic studies at UC Santa Cruz. She is an interdisciplinary scholar whose research and teaching focus on race, social inequality, policing, violence, and protests. Prior to arriving at UCSC, she held appointments at the University of Texas at Austin, Dickinson College, and Duke University. She received her PhD in American Studies from New York University and her bachelor's degree in Comparative American Studies and Latin American Studies from Oberlin College. Today, she will discuss her latest book project, Up Against the Wall, Policing and the Making of Latinxes. Up Against the Wall, according to Dr. LeBron's website, aims to uncover the centrality of policing to the emergence and consolidation of Latinx identity in the United States. The book demonstrates that policing has played an essential, although chronically underexamined, role in shaping how we understand Latinxes and their place within American society. Dr. LeBrón is also the author of Policing Life and Death, Race, Violence, and Resistance in Puerto Rico, and also Against Muerto Rico, Lessons from the Verano, Boricua. Along with Yarimar Bonilla, she is the co-editor of Aftershocks of a Disaster, Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm. She has published her research in a variety of venues, including Science, Society and Space, Modern American History, Radical History Review, Journal of Urban History, Souls and Women in Performance, and NACLA Report on the Americas. And I just wanted to say that when we reached out to Dr. LeBrón, she was extraordinarily gracious in accepting our invitation, and she's been a pleasure to work with. And now I'll turn it over to you, Dr. LeBrón.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robbie. And, I want to just thank you and Jeremy for the invitation to be here today and to share my work with you all. I'm really excited to be a part of the series. And just, I want to say how kind of impressive this series of conversations is, just the kind of breadth of speakers and topics that have been a part of this. It's an honor to be a part of the series and to be in kind of conversation with those folks, but then also to share my work today. So, before I get started talking about this new project that I'm working on, I would be remiss to, I think, not mention what's happening in Gaza. And, I think as scholars who are concerned with issues of policing, with issues of racialization, I think scholars who are, speaking for myself, at least as someone who's in ethnic studies, Latinx studies, as a scholar who is committed to the work of exposing racial inequality and hierarchy, as well as structures of colonialism, whether settler colonialism or otherwise. I think what we're watching unfold, whether we consider ourselves people who are experts on the region or not, right? Or whether we buy into the lie that this is so complicated, no one could possibly understand what's happening, right? I think much of what we're happening is incredibly legible, right? To scholars who are scholars of race and policing, right? I think we see the ways in which violent structures of racialization, of dispossession are unfolding and are embedded not only by the military, but by a violent everyday policing that functions to keep Palestinians corralled and in their place, and to help the process of dispossession in Palestine. And so I think as scholars of policing, we owe it to be in solidarity, to speak out against the genocide that is unfolding in Gaza right now. And I think especially as scholars of policing, knowing that Israel sends officials to cities all over the United States in order to train them in the latest anti-riots technologies, these exchanges that activists have called deadly exchanges between Israeli policing officials and U.S. forces, U.S. police forces all over the country, right? Essentially to refine technologies of racialized policing. I think we owe it to be in solidarity and to speak out against these what we're seeing right now. So I wanted to begin by saying that, because I think we owe it to ourselves and to Palestinians to be in solidarity at this time. So my talk for today is focused on this new project that I'm working on. As Robbie had said in the introduction, my work has focused generally on questions of policing, race, and colonialism in contemporary Puerto Rico. And so in my previous book, In Policing Life and Death, Race, Violence, and Resistance in Puerto Rico, what I tried to do in that book was really understand the colonial relationship and the shifting nature of that colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States through the lens of policing. So if one of the lies that we're always told is that, there is no more colonialism, right? The United States no longer has colonies. For me, policing actually emerged as a lens that helps us to see what is often invisibilized, right, by these kind of discourses of, democracy and freedom, and see the ways in which Puerto Rico still is a colonized territory of the United States, but also this shifting way in which as the colonial relationship has shifted and become harder to sometimes pin down, policing actually makes very clear the contours of that relationship. And so now my work has kind of shifted a little bit to think about, as a result of that, and as a result of actually my teaching and my students, my incredible students that I've been so fortunate to have over the past many years. But I started teaching this class, oh my gosh, in like 2000, I don't know, 15 or something like that, I think was the first time I taught it. This class, Policing Latinidad. And in that class, I tried to think about what are the ways in which Latinx people in the United States have encountered structures of policing, and to think about it also, based on my work in Puerto Rico from a kind of transnational or, cross-border lens. And, that class, when I started teaching it in 2015, it was tough to find, materials for that class, right? There was a way in which, as I'll get into, policing was not necessarily seen as a core kind of issue of Latinx studies, and that shifted over time. But definitely at the time when I began teaching that class, I had to be kind of creative in terms of some of the text I assigned. And so that's actually what led me to this current project now, is to try and make sense of the centrality of policing to understanding the experience of Latinx people in the United States, right? And in particular, the ways in which policing has actually been central to shaping both how Latinx people think about themselves, but how others also think about Latinx populations. And so in terms of the talk for today, I'm going to kind of start with 3 examples that I think are really illustrative of the ways in which policing shapes Latinx life in the US. So I'm going to go through these 3 examples. As I'm sharing what occurred, I'll also add some analysis about what's happening. And then at the end, I'll kind of wrap up with, what I'm trying to do in the book and the kind of key intervention that I'm trying to make with thinking about this history. So I'll go ahead and get started with the first example. So On the evening of December 5th, 2020, Cajon Nazario was driving through Windsor, a small rural town in Virginia, when he saw police lights flashing in his rearview. Nazario, an active duty second lieutenant in the Army, was on his way home following a drill weekend and dressed in his military uniform. Reluctant to stop on a dark stretch of Route 460, where police first signaled for him to pull over, Nazario drove about a mile to a well-lit BP station. Nazario was careful to drive below the speed limit all the way to the nearby gas station so as not to alarm the officers. Nazario, who is a Black Latinx man in his 30s, had reason to be cautious. Eric Garner, who was killed in 2014 by NYPD officer Daniel Pantaleo as a result of an illegal chokehold and whose final words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying call for the Black Lives Matter movement, was part of Nazario's extended family. According to family members, Nazario considered Garner to be like an uncle. Perhaps fearing a similar fate, Nazario placed his cell phone on the dash of his brand new Chevy Tahoe and hit record in order to capture his encounter with law enforcement. Nazario immediately saw two officers approach with guns drawn and pointed directly at him. The officers shouted at him to get out of the car. Trying to understand what had triggered this response from the officers, Nazario asked, "What's going on?" Joe Gutierrez, an officer with the Windsor Police, told Nazario, quote, "What's going on is you're fixing to ride the lightning, son," end quote. Gutierrez later said he was threatening to tase Nazario, but Jonathan Arthur, Nazario's lawyer, noted that the phrase "ride the lightning" is also slang for the electric chair, right? And so there becomes this question of, is he threatening to kind of execute, right, Nazario? Following Gutierrez's threat, Nazario continues to ask what's going on, only to be told to get out of the car by the two officers. After a bit of back and forth, when Nazario's pleased to be told why he was pulled over, only met by the police demands to exit the vehicle, he says, quote, "I'm serving this country and this is how I'm treated," end quote. Gutierrez retorts, quote, "You know what? Guess what? I'm a veteran too, and I learned how to obey," end quote. Officer Gutierrez and the other officer on the scene, Daniel Crocker, go back to yelling at Nazario to get out of the car. Crocker asked Nazario to work with us and get out of the car, followed by Gutierrez barking, "You received an order, obey it." Nazario responds, quote, "I'm honestly afraid to get out. Can I ask what's going on?" End quote. Before Nazario can finish his sentence, Officer Gutierrez says, quote, "Yeah, you should be. Get out." End quote. The situation continues to spiral out of control as officers become increasingly aggressive in the face of Nazario's perceived non-compliance. Finally, Nazario is told he's being stopped for a traffic violation. When Nazario calmly replies that he does not need to exit the vehicle for a simple traffic violation, Officer Gutierrez continues to escalate the situation. After trying to forcibly remove Nazario from the car, Gutierrez tells his colleague to back up and proceeds to pepper spray Nazario in the face at point-blank range. Body cam footage shows the chemical irritant running down Nazario's hands and face as he coughed while trying to keep his hands up and in full view of the officers. As officers kept yelling at Nazario to get out of the car, he said, "I'm trying to breathe," a haunting echo of Eric Garner's last words. Gutierrez told Nazario that if he didn't get out of the car and onto the ground, that he was going to, quote, "do it again." To which Nazario responded, quote, "I don't even want to reach for my seatbelt," end quote. Blinded by the pepper spray, Nazario struggled to get his seatbelt off and get out of the car. Gutierrez can be heard telling Nazario, "You made this more difficult than it had to be if you had just complied." It was Nazario's failure to comply completely with the officer's orders, more than any actual traffic violation, that made the violence against him warranted and justified in the minds of the officers. Once out of the car, according to Nazario, Gutierrez delivered knee strikes in order to knock him to the ground. Nazario also accused the officers of repeatedly hitting him before ultimately handcuffing him. Video from Gutierrez's body cam captured the officer repeatedly blaming Nazario for what occurred, saying he should have just complied, despite never being told why he was pulled over in the first place. Finally, Nazario was told why he was pulled over: failure to display a rear license. The temporary tags provided by the dealer, however, were taped to the back window and visible in the body cam footage captured by officers. Gutierrez threatened Nazario, telling him that if he wrote a summons for failure to display a license plate and obstruction of justice, which is what they were charging him with because he wouldn't get out of the car immediately, the army would be notified, and the soldier might get into trouble as a result. So Gutierrez says, quote, if you want to chill and let this thing go, end quote, that he would release him from custody and just kind of not make a big deal about it. Later in footage from the scene, Gutierrez is heard telling Nazario, quote, I get it. The media spewing race relations between law enforcement and minorities, end quote, seeming to indicate that he understood Nazario's initial apprehension. Indeed, Gutierrez told authorities afterwards that Nazario's decision to wait to pull over until he reached a well-lit public area indicated to Gutierrez that the car was, quote, almost certainly being driven by a minority, end quote. Gutierrez, despite his Spanish surname, it seemed, lacked solidarity with Latinx people like Nazario, who, because of his Blackness, is already seen as a threat, and even more so when he supposedly evaded officers by pulling into a well-lit public area in the hopes that he might avoid humiliation, violence, and even death at the hands of police. As journalist Julio Ricardo Varela puts it, quote, Gutierrez's actions showed how white supremacy has shaped the attitudes of many Latinos, sometimes with deadly consequences, end quote. Gutierrez's role in Nazario's brutalization highlights the way that white supremacy structures both everyday police encounters as well as conservative iterations of Latinidad. The public didn't see the footage from Nazario's traffic stop until 4 months later, when his lawsuit against officers Gutierrez and Crocker were made public. The lawsuit accused the officers of violating his First and Fourth Amendment rights, racial profiling, and excessive force. Nazario was seeking $1 million in damages. During testimony delivered at the trial by Nazario and his family, the public learned about the lasting effects of the traffic stop. Nazario revealed that he had been diagnosed with anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, following the incident. His partner, Sadie Madu, painfully detailed how Nazario's life and that of his family had been fundamentally altered as a result of this police violence that he experienced. Quote, he's just different, he's changed, end quote, she said. Madu told the court that Nazario had become fixated on the video of the incident and that she would see him watching it over and over and over again, sometimes while crying, sometimes when he was supposed to be minding the couple's newborn son. According to Madu, Nazario suffers from intense nightmares, is triggered by certain phrases that remind him of his encounter with the officers, and has become increasingly detached from the world around him. Additionally, he started carrying a gun with him everywhere he goes, including around his home. His PTSD resulting from the traffic stop, Nazario testified, also negatively impacted his career in the military, as he has not met, and this is their language, the Army's recovery standard in order to remain on active duty. After the video of Nazario's traffic stop went viral on social media, Gutierrez was fired for failing to follow department policy, while Crocker remains on the force. After hearing all of the evidence, a jury largely sided with the police and awarded Nazario a paltry $3,685 in damages. The jury's decision seems to reinforce the notion that police violence is acceptable in the face of actual or perceived non-compliance by a Black man, even when dressed in military uniform, and that he is a threat that needed to be forcibly subdued. So I'm going to give the second example now. On March 29th, 2021, at 2:36 a.m., Chicago police received an alert from the city's controversial shot spotter technology that 8 shots had been fired in the vicinity of the 2300 block of South Sawyer Avenue in the predominantly Mexican neighborhood of Little Village. Spot Shotter, which is an acoustic gunshot detection system, is installed in over 117 square miles of the city and is overwhelmingly concentrated in the 12 police districts with the highest proportion of Black and Latinx residents. 10 minutes after Spot Shotter alerted police to gunshots, 13-year-old Adam Toledo would be pronounced dead at the scene after being shot in the chest by Officer Eric Stillman. Police body cams captured the events that led in quick succession to Toledo's killing. When police arrived at the area identified by spot shotter, they saw two people running into a nearby alley. Police said that one of the individuals was holding a gun. Seconds after Officer Stillman jumps out of his patrol vehicle, he apprehends a young man, 21-year-old Ruben Roman. Stillman quickly hands Roman off to another officer and continues his pursuit of the other individual. Stillman is heard yelling, police, stop right fucking now. When Stillman catches up to the suspect, he orders, hands, show me your fucking hands, drop it. The boy is seen tossing aside what appears to be a gun. He then raises his empty hands and turns around. Less than a second later, Stillman fatally shoots Toledo in the chest. Toledo did everything Stillman asked of him, but he didn't get to make it home to his family that night. As sociologist Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve notes, quote, so compliance doesn't even seem to save you, not even a child, end quote. Officials from the city and Chicago Police Department, CPD, released false and misleading information following the police killing of Toledo. Tom Ahern, a CPD spokesperson, referred to an armed confrontation between an officer and an armed individual in a tweet about 3 hours after the shooting. Ahern's tweet emphasized that a gun had been recovered at the scene and included an image of the firearm. The CPD's official statement released the afternoon after the shooting said, quote, one armed offender fled from officers. A foot pursuit ensued, which resulted in a confrontation, end quote. Days after the shooting, CPD finally released Toledo's name and age to the public on April 1st. On April 5th, Mayor Lori Lightfoot and Police Superintendent David Brown held a news conference at the New Life Church on the city's west side, where they referred to Toledo's shooting as complicated, and once again emphasized that a gun was recovered from the scene. Even though shots were never fired at Officer Stillman and the gun recovered at the scene had not ever been pointed at the officer by either of the suspects, the mayor and police superintendent led the police to believe that Toledo was dangerous because he was in possession of a gun, and that Stillman was, as a result, justified. Rather than discussing the CPD record of shooting unarmed civilians, including a startling amount of children, Lightfoot said that the issue is that Toledo was a quote-unquote lonely child with no one to turn to except for neighborhood gangs, a characterization that Toledo's family rejected. Also conveniently left out of the initial reporting about the shooting was the fact that Stillman had 4 use of force reports and 3 complaints filed against him since 2017. A bond hearing for Ruben Roman held on April 10th. At this hearing, prosecutors alleged that Toledo was holding a gun in his hand when he was fatally shot by Officer Stillman. Finally, on April 15th, a Chicago Civilian Office of Police Accountability, or COPA, made all available material related to the shooting available to the public. Everything seemed to contradict what the city and police officials had been saying. Toledo was unarmed with his hands up in the air when Officer Stillman, who was not in anything remotely resembling imminent danger, took less than a second to make the call to shoot him square in the chest. The city and police party line in the days following Toledo's killing was a reminder that police lie, and that they lie often in order to justify their violent actions against civilians. Even though it was clear that the city and police officials initially lied before COPA released the materials related to the shooting, the media, law enforcement officials, and conservative members of the public continued to peddle harmful propaganda that reinforced the notion that those people are dangerous and the police have to do what they have to do to protect the rest of us, as well as themselves. Jacqueline Cerrado, editor-in-chief of the Chicago-based Southside Weekly, noted that the media took police at their word with little corroborating evidence and circulated unquestioned police narratives. Quote, they took care of criminalizing Adam, end quote, and then as a result shifted public scrutiny away from the police. Immediately following the shooting, before COPA released the footage, accusations about Toledo's criminality and broken family life circulated on social media and in news outlets. In the Chicago Tribune, in a column published on April 6th, Eric Zorn challenged the community calls for justice by suggesting that Toledo was no angel. And that phrase, of course, no angel, reminds us of Mike Brown, right? This was exactly what was said after his killing, right? To exonerate the police, right? Citing cases where 13-year-olds, I mean, and this is like this Eric Zorn piece is really just this, right? Citing cases where 13-year-olds have in fact killed people. Zorn says, quote, 13-year-olds aren't inherently angelic, end quote. And that if Toledo was in fact holding a gun, he might have been even more dangerous than an adult because of the, quote, lack of judgment and impulse control in adolescence, end quote. Zorn invoked a well-worn racist trope that adultified children of color, especially Black children, and cast them as presumed criminal, to borrow a phrase from Carl Sudler. Similarly, conservative pundit Sean Hannity referred to Toledo as a 13-year-old man as a way of erasing any notion of innocence typically granted to children, especially if they're white. Rumors also swirled about Toledo's supposed gang affiliation. Toledo was killed in an area identified as a Latin King stronghold and was therefore assumed to be part of the gang, despite there being no evidence. Far-right journalist Andy Ngo, for instance, grabbed the screenshot, tweeted a screen grab from the Copa release footage that showed Toledo with a gun, accompanied by claims that Toledo was in a gang and known by the names Little Homicide and Baby Diablo. Ngo's tweets purposefully framed Toledo as a threatening gangbanger and didn't share any of the stills of the footage that show him tossing the gun or with his empty hands up a second before he is fatally shot. Ngo's tweets prompted responses that blamed Toledo's mother for letting him run the streets and justified Stillman's actions. Toledo's supposed gang affiliation rendered him completely expendable and ultimately deserving of death at the hands of law enforcement. John Catanzara, president of the Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 7, a Chicago police union, went so far as to call Stillman's actions heroic and 100% justified following the release of the footage of Toledo's killing. And while many inside and outside Chicago participated in the criminalization of Adam Toledo and blamed him and his family for his death at the hands of police, others, especially young Latinx people from Little Village and other marginalized neighborhoods, challenged police narratives and saw themselves in Toledo. Activists noticed that Toledo's killing was part of a larger pattern of police misconduct and violence within Chicago's communities of color, where Black and Latinx youth were more likely to be killed as a result of police intervention than their white peers. Diego, a teenager from Little Village, told NBC News, quote, "I don't even feel safe in my block because of gangbangers. And now with the cops doing this, I don't even feel safe around them either," end quote. Diego's comments, like those of other young people who spoke out following Toledo's killing, highlight that Latinx youth in economically and racially marginalized communities like Little Village find themselves enmeshed in a complex web of violence and victimization where they are vulnerable both to state and interpersonal violence. For these youth, police are often seen as key generators of violence and viewed as largely ineffective in preventing or responding to violence and harm in their communities. Others, especially young men who were formerly street involved, pointed out that the Toledo story was similar to that of many youth living in Black and Latinx neighborhoods throughout Chicago and around the country. But in killing Toledo, police robbed him of an opportunity to turn his life around and grow up. While white youth are offered second chance after second chance, one false step can lead to death for so many Black and Latinx youth who are seen as inherently dangerous and irredeemable. Almost a year after Toledo was killed, the state attorney's office said that they would not be filing charges against the officer involved in Toledo's case. And right now, Stillman is in the middle of a disciplinary hearing, which could lead to him being fired, but that is still ongoing. Nonetheless, Chicago's Latinx youth still feel like targets of police action and violence. Just a few days after Toledo's killing, 22-year-old Latinx youth Anthony Alvarez died after being shot in the back by Officer Evan Solano in the city's north side. Alvarez was walking by himself on March 31st, 2022, when police, recognizing him from a failed traffic stop the night before, signaled him with their lights. Alvarez was not committing any crime or engaging in any suspicious activities, but officers pursued him on foot anyway. When police caught up to Alvarez, he was getting up after having slipped. Officer Solano shot Alvarez 5 times in the span of 1 second. Like Toledo, it only took an officer a split second to decide that Alvarez, an unarmed Latinx youth, was a threat that needed to be eliminated. This is my last example. On the morning of May 23rd, 2022, 18-year-old Salvador Ramos was arguing with his grandmother about his cell phone. Fed up, Ramos grabbed a gun, shot his grandmother in the face, and stole her pickup truck. He drove the truck in the direction of Robb Elementary School, ultimately crashing it into a ditch near the school. He walked towards the school carrying an AR-15 style rifle and a backpack full of ammo. Ramos was a troubled young man, obsessed with gore and guns, who showed warning signs that he planned to enact serious violence. On social media, Ramos had earned the nickname school shooter because of the regular threats that he had made against others online. He dropped out of Uvalde High School and worked a series of fast food jobs. He was fired from Whataburger for harassing a woman he worked with, and at Wendy's, he kept to himself except for occasionally trying unsuccessfully to engage other coworkers in conversations about guns. When he was 17 years old, Ramos tried to purchase a gun, but was denied. Instead, he purchased accessories, a gun sight, a rifle sling, and a body armor carrier. His family was aware of his obsession with guns and his attempts to illegally purchase firearms. Once Ramos turned 18 on May 16, 2022, the legal age to purchase firearms in Texas, he set about arming himself. He spent more than $3,000 on 2 AR-15 style rifles from an online retailer and picked them up from a local gun shop in Uvalde. Since Ramos didn't have a license or know how to drive, his uncle took him to pick up the guns. The owner of the gun shop would later describe Ramos as, quote, an average customer with no red flags, end quote. Tellingly, an unmoored and emotionally troubled 18-year-old purchasing 2 high-power assault rifles just a few days after he is legally allowed to do so is not a red flag for so many, given how wrapped up gun ownership is in with ideas of patriotism in the United States. No one ever alerted the authorities about Ramos's behavior. Only 8 days after he turned 18, Ramos scaled the fence outside of Robb Elementary and entered the school through a series of unlocked doors. With his loaded assault weapon in hand, Ramos burst into room 111, one of 2 interconnected 4th grade classrooms, and started shooting. Ramos went between the 2 rooms, shooting at the children and teachers trapped inside. Despite copious active shooter trainings to prepare police for these kinds of emergencies, no one detained or incapacitated the shooter. Instead, footage from officers' body cameras, as well as accounts from those present, indicate that the officers were reticent to go up against a gunman armed with such high-powered weapons, and instead spent their time largely arguing over chain of command. Whose responsibility was it, anyway, to go in and deal with this? Officers also spent precious time that could have been used to save lives looking for keys to doors that were in all likelihood unlocked during much of the time that Ramos was in rooms 111 and 112, which is how he got in there, right? At 12:10, about half an hour after the shooting began, Chloe Torres and Mia Cerrillo called 911 and alerted authorities to the location and actions of the shooter. The girls told the police that they were trapped with the shooter and that there were still children alive who needed help. The girls begged the police to come in and save them. Later, Mia Cerrillo revealed that she had to save herself by smearing herself with her dead friend's blood. Arnulfo Reyes, one of the 4th grade teachers who was wounded but ultimately survived, told the press that he heard students from the neighboring classroom pleading with police in the hallways for help. Police didn't answer their calls and instead seemed to retreat. All 11 of the children in Reyes' classroom were murdered that day. Eva Mirales, one of the 4th grade teachers, called to say that she had been shot and was dying. Her husband, Ruben Ruiz, who was a school police officer, grabbed his gun and tried to run towards the classroom, but was stopped by other officers before being disarmed and made to leave the scene. Law enforcement wouldn't breach the fourth grade classroom until 12:50, 77 minutes after Ramos first entered the school. Agents from BORTAC, the U.S. Border Patrol's tactical unit, used a master key to enter room 111, where once again, it was probably unlocked, right? Where they saw Ramos standing in front of a closet door and fatally shot him. 19 fourth graders and 2 teachers were killed that day, making the Uvalde massacre one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. The day that Ramos entered the fourth grade classroom at Robb Elementary was the last day of school that year. The children had been at an award ceremony surrounded by loved ones earlier that morning. There were still parents on school grounds and in the immediate area when the shooting started. Parents ran back and saw a sea of uniformed law enforcement failing to act. Angie Rose Gomez, a mother of one of the students, tried to run past the officers and into the building to try and do something, right? They were just smacked in the face by the inaction of law enforcement. Gomez instead was handcuffed by police and threatened with arrest. In an interview, Gomez said, quote, "If anything, they were being more aggressive on us parents. They were willing to go in there," end quote. Brandon Wolf, a survivor of the 2016 massacre at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, where 49 mostly queer Latinx people were killed, saw alarming parallels between the inadequate police response to Pulse and Uvalde. According to Wolf, quote, "We know a similar horror. While police waited 3 hours to breach the Pulse nightclub, 13 of our friends and family members died on the bathroom floor," end quote. Wolf, who now works as an LGBTQ rights and gun control advocate, noted that more guns and more police do not ensure safety, and that the events at Pulse and Robb Elementary make that painfully clear. Quote, "So this idea that more guns make us safer and that we've got to just wait and make sure that police officers have the right tools and resources to be able to respond is simply not working. It's a logical fallacy. The data tells us otherwise," Wolf told Democracy Now! All of the myths around policing, the idea that all it takes is a good guy with a gun to stop a bad guy with a gun, proved false once more during the massacre at Robb Elementary. Just as they had in so many other mass shooting events, 374 police officers could not prevent a teenage gunman who had never fired a gun before from mowing down a group of fourth graders and their teachers. Nonetheless, following the Uvalde shooting, conservative politicians doubled down on their commitment to solving every problem with more guns and more police. When Felix Rubio and Kimberly Mata Rubio confronted Texas Senator Ted Cruz with a picture of their dead 10-year-old daughter, Alexandra Lexi Anaí Rubio, laying in her casket and demanded that the senator support an assault weapon ban, he told them that he was committed to preventing another Uvalde by putting more law enforcement officers in schools, in Texas schools. Following the shooting, far-right conspiracy theories about Ramos and the shooting surged online. Some suggested that this was a false flag operation orchestrated by the government in order to curtail gun rights, which is something we've seen after like the Parkland shooting or Newtown. On 4chan, users posted photos of trans women and alleged that they were photos of the shooter. Telegram groups associated with white nationalists, meanwhile, suggested that Ramos was an undocumented immigrant. Arizona Republican Paul Gozer helped to spread these conspiracy theories in a since-deleted tweet. This stated that Ramos was, quote, "a transsexual leftist illegal alien named Salvatore Ramos," end quote. Authorities confirmed that Ramos was a citizen, but the right-wing hysteria about a dangerous, quote-unquote, illegal aliens had everything to do with the shooting at Robb Elementary and why it was so deadly and its aftermath so painful and fraught for so many Uvalde families. Uvalde is about 50 miles from the US-Mexico border and home to a permanent Customs and Border Patrol checkpoint near several immigrant detention centers. The town had experienced a recent increase in bailouts, a term used by authorities to describe instances when undocumented migrants are attempting to evade authorities. When migrants escape a detention facility or flee CBP and crash after a high-speed chase, for instance, lockdowns are triggered at local schools. According to the school district, Robb had been on lockdown on 47 occasions since February 2022, with 90% of these triggered by bailouts. Ramos crashing his car outside of Robb Elementary looked just like another bailout. And when teachers and administrators heard the sound of an alert, they may have responded with less urgency, figuring it was just another unnecessary lockdown related to immigration enforcement. The massive militarization of and expansion of enforcement personnel at the border, which politicians touted as necessary to keep Americans safe, was useless when it came to protect the people of Uvalde from the very real threat of violence in their communities. It was CBP that first responded to the alert at Robb Elementary, and it was eventually BORTAC, the Border Patrol's tactical unit, that shot and killed Ramos. It is estimated that 80 CBP agents rushed to the school during and after the shooting. In some cases, these Border Patrol agents rushed to Robb because their own children were students there. Nonetheless, their massive presence in the town was owed to an overwhelming emphasis on border policing in cities and towns along the U.S.-Mexico border. And so, what came out essentially after Uvalde is that people would call first responders and they wouldn't show up. Instead, Border Patrol would show up, right? So Border Patrol was positioned as this response to everything, right? So this visible and overwhelming presence of Border Patrol agents in the aftermath of the massacre at Robb also led to increased fears that there would be deportations, right? And the people that had kind of survived, or families they may have lost a child that were mixed status families, might be subject to deportation. So Uvalde is a predominantly Latinx town with about 80% of the residents identifying as Hispanic, and Robb has historically functioned as the town's Mexican school even after desegregation, with 90% of students identifying as Hispanic, right? And so after there's this huge concern that ICE and Border Patrol are going to start, deporting people, right? And even though they had said they were going to suspend any actions, there's still massive concern and fear among folks in Uvalde, right? And this is not unwarranted. In 2021, ICE deported a woman who had survived the 2019 massacre at an El Paso Walmart that targeted Latinx people and killed 23. Although the woman had helped prosecutors in their case against the shooter, she was deported after being stopped by police for a busted taillight. So I know I'm really stretching the time. So I'm going to try and tell you, why am I telling you these three examples, right? What do they tell us about how Latinx people in the United States experience policing? So I begin with these three examples, I spent all my time, so I didn't just begin, I spent all my time talking about these three examples. Because when taken together, they help us to see the multiple ways that Latinx people encounter the police and structures of policing in the United States. In the case of Carlos Nazario, we see how his Blackness cast him as acutely dangerous and intensified his vulnerability to police violence. Nazario's experience of violence at the hands of Officer Joe Gutierrez also shows the limits of Latinx solidarity. Although both Nazario and Gutierrez are Latinx, Gutierrez helped to uphold structures of white supremacy that underpin policing, while Nazario's Blackness made him a target of policing's racializing violence. As with the massacre at Robb Elementary, where many of the officers present were Latinx, Nazario's case shows that more Latinx officers does little to actually keep Latinx people safe. Adam Toledo's killing, meanwhile, shows that criminality has become sutured to Latinx boys and young men through the figure of the gangbanger. His killing also shows the intense police surveillance and intervention that happens in many Latinx communities, especially in urban spaces. Latinx youth find themselves under constant scrutiny from teachers, parents, community members, and police, a tangle of criminalizing interactions and relationships that sociologist Victor Rios has termed the youth control complex. The criminalization that young people experience not only fails to keep them from getting into trouble, but can actually push them to act in more harmful ways, fracture community trust, and lead to higher rates of police intervention, and as a result, violence and incarceration. Toledo's killing, as with Nazario's traffic stop, also show how police are allowed to use violence up to and including death to force bodies into compliance or punish those bodies that are perceived as non-compliant. Lastly, the massacre at Robb Elementary, much like the police saturation of neighborhoods like Little Village in Chicago, makes painfully clear that a massive number of police is no guarantee of safety. Questions of race, citizenship, gender, class, and geography cross-cut all of these examples and animate what I call the continuum of policing that operates in Latinx communities, or the ways that policing is implicitly and explicitly embedded into nearly every facet of Latinx life in the United States. Although these three examples may seem wildly different from one another, when analyzed in relation to one another, we see a fuller and more coherent picture of how Latinx people experience policing in ways that affects life and death, in ways that are both big and small. So, you know, one of the things for us to keep in mind when we think about this kind of like continuum of what I'm arguing is a continuum of policing is that Latinx people experience a range of violence at the hands of the state, especially its law enforcement apparatus, in ways that are both incremental and cumulative, right? That these forms of violence nurture other forms of violence and continue to increase vulnerability and harms at the hands of the state, as well as more intimate and interpersonal forms of interpersonal and community violence. The continuum of policing experienced by Latinx people is part and parcel of the continuum of policing operating in Latinx communities. Understanding policing as a continuum also helps us to understand the ways that its character changes gradually, or in ways that makes it hard to identify clear breaks between different elements, right? So in other words, what I'm trying to say is it's critical to understand the historical continuities that animate the multiple forms of policing that Latinx people experience today, as well as the ways that different forms of policing feed into one another, right? And I'm gonna wrap up in like 1 second here. But the history of Latinx groups in the United States has been marked from the beginning by experiences of criminalization and violence at the hands of law enforcement. In many ways, policing has left an indelible mark on Latinx communities across the country and has come to shape our very understanding of Latinidad, or what it means to be Latinx in the US. So what I try to do in the project that I'm working on now is show the centrality of policing to the emergence and consolidation of Latinx identity in the United States. So I show that policing has played an essential, though chronically underexamined role in how we understand Latinx people and their place within American society. So when and how diverse Latinx communities come into contact with the United States law enforcement apparatus tells us a great deal about how Latinx groups are positioned within hierarchies of belonging related to race, citizenship, class, and spatial location in ways that have deadly reverberations. So in particular, what I'm trying to do with this project is trace how policing functions as a structuring component of everyday life for Latinx people that both facilitates and manages the effects of settler colonial dispossession, imperialist expansion, economic exploitation, and racial differentiation. So if the saying goes, we are here because you were there, right? Alluding to the idea that Latinx people are in the United States as a result of colonial and capitalist violence in Latin America and the Caribbean, then it is worth noting that the very first representatives of US state power that Latinx people encounter are law enforcement officials, and that it will continue to be the case as they settle and form communities, right? And then the last thing I just want to say is that even though these you know, one of the things that's key about Latino as a category, right, is that it's essentially an incoherent category, right? It brings together all of these people with different citizenship statuses, different racial and ethnic backgrounds, different geographical backgrounds, different kinds of experiences, and puts them together in this one category. And part of what I'm arguing is that, like, policing and the experience of criminalization in the United States is part of what makes that category cohesive, right? Part of what makes that category real, both in terms of the state criminalizing these different groups, but also the solidarity that's fostered between these different Latinx groups to see themselves and one another as a result of this process of criminalization. So I'm going to stop there because I know I'm like really over time, but thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to being in conversation and to the questions. Thank you.
No, thank you. Very good information. And you know, I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to go right to this one question that I think is going to help me with my questions. It says, which are the top 3 minority communities who are dealing with these kinds of issues? the top 3 minority?
I mean, it's a hard question I mean, I think like, part of how policing functions, right? And this is one of the things that I talk about in my book, In Policing Life and Death, right? Is that, we have to understand policing as a structuring force in society, right? So like if we, put, don't accept that this is about fighting crime, right? But that like what policing does is actually work to contain crises that emerge from racial and capitalist structures, right? As well as the descent to those forms of kind of like state exploitation and violence, right? Then we can see the ways in which groups that are othered, groups that are minoritized, either according to race or class status, according to citizenship status, right? They all experience these different forms of policing that function to both kind of eliminate dissent and also maintain a kind of racial and capitalist colonial status quo, right? And that's like part of what I'm also trying to do in this book. And so, I think for like as a way to kind of answer this question, right? I think like various minoritized groups, right? Various groups that are othered are going to experience policing, right? And so like I'm teaching a class right now that's about the history of sex and sexuality and the carceral state, right? And there's ways in which gay and lesbian and trans people experience intense criminalization and policing, right? In ways that do and sometimes don't intersect with racialization, right? Or class policing, right? Labor policing and things like that. But, in the book, one of the things that I'm trying to do is think about policing as a Latinx issue because of the ways in which Latinx identity has been structured in the United States as this kind of like social mobility, social striver, ethnic group that's like so close to whiteness, right? That totally erases both the presence of Afro-Latinos, right? And the kinds of really intensified forms of policing that they experience as a result of their Blackness, right? Being enmeshed, even if they're Latinx, right, being enmeshed within this anti-Blackness as structures policing in the United States, as well as the forms of criminalization and distancing that happen within Latinx communities, right, to those folks who are identified as Black, right? But then at the same time that we see that there are various axes, right, according to like whether one is documented or undocumented, whether one might be queer, whether one might be working class or poor, whether one might live in public housing, right? All of these things expose people to police violence and intervention, right? And also to networks of surveillance that operate both within and outside of state purview, right? So the ways in which we all engage in structures of policing, right, and criminalization, right, that aid and abet kind of these larger state structures. So I'm kind of answering the question in a roundabout way because I don't think it's like the question in answering the question. There's a kind of push for a ranking, right? That I would say the way that policing functions, right, is actually in targeting these social groups that are othered and that these identities are intersectional, right? So if we think about Latinx people, right, like it's intersecting with anti-Blackness, it's intersecting with the criminalization of immigrants, right, and undocumented people, it's intersecting with the criminalization of poor people and working class people, right? It's intersecting also with the policing of political dissidents, right? So that's kind of how that's how I'm kind of answering this question, right? Is that I think we have to look at all of these kind of different axes of criminalization and the ways that they intersect.
Thank you. Well, just a minute, Mario, one more question. This is my question. In policing, every time something major goes down or happens, the responses, and you did touch on this, the response is always, well, the reason how to fix it is more police, more protection, and we've looked at that in many ways. Also, in the same sense, if you put 30 cops in an area, my guess is the crime is going to go up in that area. because you're going to see everything they do. And yet they put them in the minority areas and not in the white areas. But if they did put them in the white areas, I would also see the crime go up. So my question is back to the original one, is more policing doesn't work. What's the solution?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I mean, so that's something I deal with really extensively in my first book, in Policing Life and Death, right? Is like the kind of twofold elements of this, right? Which is that, like, you know, that actually when we see an increase in police presence, right, we see, as you know, an increase in crime in that area, right? Because like you're gonna stop more people, you're gonna arrest more people, you're gonna, like, you know, policing creates the crime, right? Like the very thing that is trying to eliminate it, it creates it, right? And so that's one thing that's happening. But also in those neighborhoods, you know, and this is something I talk about in my research in Puerto Rico, but you see that also happening in, you know, parallels to this in the United States, obviously, that we're all kind of like familiar with, right? But like when you see more police presence in a neighborhood in response to like so-called, you know, epidemics of crime or whatever, right? Increased crime rates, what we actually see happening in those neighborhoods is an increase among residents of feelings of insecurity and fear, right? That the increased police presence very often does not alleviate kind of any social feelings of insecurity, but intensifies them, because greater police presence almost always leads to greater police interaction with civilians, which always then introduces an opportunity for violence to occur, right? Or for some kind of harm, right? It doesn't always need to be, you know, police brutality or these police killings, right? But, you know, you'll hear from individuals who are living in, you know, criminalized areas with high police presence, right? A feeling of always being surveilled, a feeling of then inferiority because of what it communicates that you are in a community that needs this police presence, right? Or a feeling of intensified feelings of social exclusion, right? So, which are also forms of harm, right? Even if they're not what we would identify always as police violence, right? And so, you know, in my research, part of what I argue, right, is that like these instances where we see the state respond to, you know, spikes in crime or, you know, social anxieties over crime with more police, they actually tend to make the problem worse, right? And especially make the problem worse for individuals who are living in these areas, right, that are actually experiencing crime, right, that it further criminalizes, that it creates further instability, intensifies social exclusion, and so on. The other element of this, right, is like, you know, and this is like what we've seen after the protests of 2020, right, and these kind of renewed calls for rethinking policing is like the DEI response to policing, right, which is like, well, we need more police, but we need to make sure that all of these new police are like women or Black or Latinx or whatever, right? Because the problem is not the police. The problem is that the police are white or the police are men, right? Or the police are straight, like whatever. So this call to diversify the police. And so what I show in my book, right, is that like it doesn't matter, right? Because the purpose of policing, whether regardless of who's doing it, is to uphold the social status quo, which is rooted in white supremacy and capitalist exploitation and settler colonialism, right? And so like it doesn't matter who's enforcing that, right? That you're not addressing what the structural purpose of policing is, right? And so it's always going to produce racially disparate outcomes that intensify forms of economic dispossession, social repression, especially of like political dissidents, right? And so, you know, I point to the example of the Puerto Rican police, right? Like the Puerto Rican police are what, you know, like by US standards are like a totally racially diverse group of men and women, right? Who are actually coming from the communities in which they're policing. And they have time and time again been identified by citizens as well as, you know, the US Department of Justice as one of the most violent and politically corrupt police under US jurisdiction, right? Time and time again, right? So it doesn't matter that they're racially diverse. It doesn't matter that many come from working class backgrounds, right? It does not prevent really intense, racially violent policing from occurring, right? It doesn't prevent class-based policing from happening, right? And so, and we see that also with the Border Patrol, right? The majority of the Border Patrol is Latinx, right? And it does not prevent the kinds of intense anti-immigrant, anti-Latinx violence that the Border Patrol represents, right? Because the job of the Border Patrol is to uphold those structures, right? Regardless of who's doing it. And so, I think these are really important things. And I try to show this in my book that actually, like, the solution, the question is, all right, if those are the problems, what are the solutions? And what I found in my research is that, like, when you actually listen to communities that are experiencing violence, that are experiencing crime, they're experiencing this really intense social disruptions, they have solutions that are not about policing to deal with it, right? So I look at a community that's a predominantly Afro-Puerto Rican community in Puerto Rico called Loíza, and I look at a feminist public health organization, Taller Salud, and their ceasefire program, and they worked through violence interruption with young men who were involved in neighborhood gangs and tried to provide them with other ways of affirming their masculinity, for instance. They were not based in understanding masculinity as intrinsically tied to violence, right? They worked to interrupt violence that was going to occur, right? To like through de-escalation, right? They work to provide those young men with more recreational activities, with more access to social integration, more access to jobs, to education, all of these things, right? Stable housing, those are what they're calling for, right? And those are not things that the police can solve, right? And so when you actually talk to communities, they're very clear on what will solve problems of violence and precarity in their communities, right? But that's not it's slow. It's slow going. It's hard work, right? And so politicians don't want to invest in that, right? Because they want the quick thing to show that they're taking the problem seriously, right? Which is the police, but we see that it actually makes those problems worse.
Thank you. So you actually answered my question, so I'll go back to our Q&A. And the question is, how can we study and illustrate the racialized nature of policing in Puerto Rico and across the region when we constantly avoid acknowledging that racism and racial hierarchy even exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is part of what I try to address in my book. And, I think it's also something that shapes how we think about the problem of policing in Latinx communities, right? Is this like reluctance to deal with race in like in these communities, right? And so, like, in Puerto Rico, one of the things that I talk about, which has parallels but is not exactly the same, and US diasporic Latinx communities, right, is that in places like Puerto Rico and other sites in Latin America, right, the kind of allure of racial democracy discourse is so strong, right? It's to say, like, we're all mixed race, my family might have Black folks in it, right? We all have this ancestry that, we're this harmonious mix of three cultures of African, indigenous and European roots, right? Like all of that kind of stuff that ignores the very real ways in which people who are overtly racialized as Black, right, they are subjected to intensely racialized forms of policing and criminalization, right? The kind of disparate opportunities and life outcomes, right, that occur, right? So those get papered over by this racial democracy discourse. And so that's one of the things I also tried to do in my research, is to say, like, if something that's occluded is this idea that, things are not as bad in Puerto Rico as they are in the United States, right? And so, like, people can say, like, oh, we don't need Black Lives Matter in Puerto Rico because we don't have that problem here. And if people say we have that problem here, they're importing these US frameworks of race, right? And the argument I make in my book is that that's not true, right? And that, in fact, you have the like as much as there's an attempt to exceptionalize, you know, Latin American forms of race and racialization to those of the United States, right? That like what undergirds them both is white supremacy and a history of colonization, right? And so that in that way, the logics are more similar than they are different, right? Although articulations might differ between those two sites, right? And so that's part of what I try to say. That's part of what I try to show in the book, right? Is that like if we actually look at what policing does, it's very clear this is not a racial democracy, right? It's very clear that policing produces, not only produces racially disparate outcomes, but it helps us understand race, and particularly through its suturing of Blackness and criminality, right? It's these ideas, it's pernicious racial ideas, right? Racist ideas. And you see a kind of similar thing happening, I argue, in Latinx communities in the United States too, where it's like policing is often framed as like an issue that's not as relevant to Latinx people, right? Because that's seen as more of like a Black issue, right? Which again, it totally eclipses the presence of Black people in Latinx communities, right? As well as proximity that, you know, I'm from the Bronx, right? And it's like the kind of questions of proximity, right? Latinx people are living alongside African Americans or Black Caribbean folks, right? And so like that gets totally ignored, right? That like the policing in that community is happening, right? And so that's about a kind of appeal to respectability politics. That's about appeal to kind of white supremacy as a way of achieving social advancement in the United States, right? That we see kind of like a conservative thrust in Latinx communities to downplay the ways in which Latinx people have historically always fought against police violence, have experienced police violence, right? So Aaron Fontaine Jr. has this really incredible, you know, I really suggest people check it out. Really amazing work on the history of Latinx police riots, right? Like against like these race riots against like police violence, right? That have happened in places like Newark. You know, we can think about the Division Street riots in Chicago, right? That were happening often right alongside those of African Americans, right? During the period of the 1960s and 70s, right? That these were communities that understood themselves as experiencing similar racially violent forms of exclusion that were exemplified by policing, right? And that understood themselves in shared struggle. And we see similar kind of eruptions. Of course, the intensity is more directed at Black folks, right? But to act that Black Latinx people are now did my mic go out for a second? I just had a weird thing. Yes. Oh, sorry. So, but to erase that history, I think is to the detriment of us actually understanding the history of Latinx people in this country, right?
Do you think that foundationally, and I'm thinking of history of policing, that this ability to achieve some sort of whiteness, and with the Nazario incident in mind, and I'm thinking about the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th, when Irish were not considered white under current standards. There's so many Irish that went into the police department to achieve that whiteness. Do you think that is still echoing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what's happening. You know, I think about like Sidney Herring's work on, you know, policing and class society, and that's one of the things he talks about, right? Is like in the early, you know, or late 19th, early 20th century, right? The ways in which like these ethnic whites start to consolidate whiteness is around the policing of these other racial others, right? So they start to consolidate their own whiteness through this adherence to policing as a structure, right? And so we have to think about like policing as a racializing and racialized structure in the ways that it racializes policing, right? But also those that are policed, right? And so I think we do see kind of parallels to that among, police or Latinx people or other people of color, they enter, the police. I think there's people that enter because they genuinely think that they are going to help their communities, right? And like want to help. And then we also see, and that are then disillusioned, right? So I think about the NYPD whistleblowers on stop and frisk were mostly Black and Latinx police officers that were like, I got in this to help my community, and then was like making things worse for my community, right? And so like, you know, I think you have those people, and then you also have people that are like, I'm not like those other people, and so I'm going to enter into this institution that's going to grant me this kind of status within society that effectively distances me from those people. And, you know, we see this in kind of like historical record, right? Like, you know, I think it comes up in James Baldwin writes about this, but there's other kind of primary sources where we hear, you know, like Simon Balto's work touches on this too, but like, you know, African Americans in places like Chicago or New York saying like, the worst was when you had a Black officer, right? Like they intervene with you, right? Because they were always the like most violent, or they always had like an axe to grind, right? And, you know, I think you see that too with, you know, this is kind of like the narrative that has emerged around, you know, Border Patrol and Latinx communities, right? Is this way in which like Latinx citizenship is consolidated through this policing of the non-citizen, right? That this effective distancing is able to occur, right? And so I think it's really messy, but I also think it's, you know, when we think of, again, if we zoom back and think about like, what is the role of policing, right? Then these outcomes are not necessarily surprising, right? Or the ways in which people are both are racialized and use policing to racialize, then again, are not kind of surprising, right?
Mike, you have anything?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've had a bad connection for most of this, so I apologize for that. And if you can't hear me, but I don't know if this question will result in a doubling of the time that we're here. But particularly in doing your research in Puerto Rico, you know, the idea that law enforcement is enforcing colonial structures is most prevalent with the FBI's and federal law enforcement activity in Puerto Rico, even though a lot of that activity is focused on, as you said, police corruption.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I touch on this a little bit in my book and some other writing too, is like, it's, you know, the whole milieu of policing, right? I think in Puerto Rico, whether it's federal or local or municipal, you know, the argument I try to make is that that's all geared towards, like, in some ways, dealing with crises that arise because of colonial capitalism in Puerto Rico, right? And so, like, you know, I talk about this in this piece I wrote very, very long ago in NACLA, after the DOJ report came out in 2011, where the DOJ had said like the Puerto Rican police are incredibly corrupt, and we see always these kind of like attempts by the federal government to weed out police corruption and violence and to deal with it, like Operation Guard Shack, which is one of the largest anti-corruption stings, under federal jurisdiction, is like carried out in Puerto Rico, where they arrest like I forget, it's like 200 something police, or like 170 police officers or something like that, right? And so you know, we see this constant, so it's like this way in which, like, at the same time that the FBI and DOJ are worried about police corruption, right, they're like facilitating things like, you know, the Puerto Rican version of COINTELPRO targeting anti-independence activists during the 1960s and 70s, known as Las Carpetas, where the police were creating the division of intelligence, were creating like files on pro-independence activists, but also, you know, feminists, environmental activists, anti-military, all of that kind of stuff, right? And so, like, you know, you see this double-edged sword of kind of the FBI or federal government as, like, you know, supposedly protecting best practices and anti-corruption and whatever. They, at the same time, they're the ones that are training the police, right? They're the ones who are facilitating forms of particularly anti-colonial policing, right? So like targeting pro-independence or you know, other kind of social justice movements in Puerto Rico, and actually carrying out extrajudicial killings, right? So the FBI is who kills Filiberto Rios, who was the head of the Macheteros, which was an armed insurgency group, right? That he had been living underground, and they locate him and they murder him, right, in cold blood. And this becomes this kind of rallying point for talking about, at the same time that they want to, reform the police, these are the people who are supposed to be in charge of reforming the police. But the other thing I was going to say, though, is that the local police, the Puerto Rican police, also participate in upholding colonial structures. Right? And that's part of what I try to show in my book, is that much of what their work is dedicated to is actually managing these crises that emerge as a result of colonial capitalism in Puerto Rico, right? So the massive and explosive informal drug economy that exists in Puerto Rico, that the Puerto Rican police are so dedicated to dealing with, right? We have to understand that as part of colonialism, right? Part of why the massive informal economy grows in Puerto Rico is because colonialism has limited the range of options available to Puerto Ricans and has not addressed their needs, right? And so the growth in the informal economy has arisen out of that, right? Or these other kind of issues related to displacement and dispossession, right? That the police are always trying to squash, right? And always defending kind of the status quo, right? The colonial and economic status quo in Puerto Rico. So that's my short answer, which was not very short, but
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Marisol. We are going to wrap this up. I know we have you on our short list of coming back, so we'd love to see you after you finish.
I love that.
And thank you so much for being here with us today.
I want to
Thank you.
very
Doug,
quickly.
yes.
Yes, our raffle.
There you
We got a
go.
quick raffle. I am going to write a number between 1 and 1,000. Everybody, please, and a huge thank you to Professor LeBrón for joining us. We have a copy of Aftershocks and a copy of Policing Life and Death. Please, in the Q&A, if you'd like one of these books, very quickly write any number between 1 and 1,000. And the two that are three, actually, I have 2 copies of Policing Life and Death. We'll do this very quickly, sorry. But it's a bit fun, a bit festive. Everybody's going to enjoy one of these wonderful books. Obviously, intense material, but please write into the Q&A, not into the chat, but I do see that there was a note there from Jessica. So I'll watch the Q&A. All right, and we'll leave it open for another 10 seconds. So jump in there, put a number in. I have the number here, just wrote it down. And we will spin, and stop. Okay, there's the number, 388. Let's see, it looks like Eric Cabrera. Can my colleagues help me pick another couple? It looks like Alejandro Cancino. Or Alejandra, excuse me. And do we have another one that's close? 506, maybe, Rochelle Wirtz. All right, those are our 3. Okay, so Rochelle Wirtz and Alejandra Cancino and Eric Cabrera. Can you all please?
Did you see 17604?
Yeah.
604, was that close?
221 was the number.
221 is close.
Compared to 5.
I think those are the closest ones to 388, if you heard your name. So Eric Cabrera and Rochelle Wirtz. And if I missed one, then everybody please jump in with one that was closer than one of these ones.
17604.
All right.
221.
221.
Yeah,
Okay.
Alejandro Cancino had 345.
Alejandro Cancino. Okay, the 3 of you all. Sorry to jump in with that, but it is fun. So please email me at that email address that I just put in the chat, jmurray@csusb.edu. I will be holding on to these books for you. That was such a rich discussion. I want to turn it over to Robbie and Stan and Mike and Matt and Marisol to wrap up. That was just my little contribution to the event. But thank you so much, Marisol. That was really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here and to share with you all.
Thank you. Robbie?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor LeBrón. I really appreciate your thoughtful comments on the situation in Gaza.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.